No, no.
Oh, okay.
But we'll have an account.
Okay. I think.
I'll tell you a few things about why this issue is of importance to us. Since its founding about 11 years ago, the NYU Center for Dialogues has worked on 4 major areas concerning the Muslim world West-US relationship. One, the strategic relationship between the West and the Muslim world. 2, the Muslim communities in the West. 3, intellectual reform movements in the Muslim world. And finally, 4, governance in the Muslim world. Now, just to give you a sense of the kind of things that we do, 3 weeks ago we had a major conference on the Arab Spring and its aftermath, particularly what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt. And again, 3 weeks from now, and you are all welcome on November 18, we will have a conference on academic freedom within the context of, again, the Arab Spring. And this is a very important issue, and we will have a number of scholars coming from the region to be on the panel. So it is quite normal for us to continue consideration of issues that pertain to the relationship between the Muslim world and the West, and what is more important than the Iran-US relationship. This is not new for us. 5 years ago, exactly almost to the day, we organized a one-day conference precisely to consider the future of this relationship. That was 1 month before after the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. The conference panel was composed of political, academic, civil society leaders from the United States and Iran to imagine a paradigm in which the two powers were not perpetual enemies. Some of our distinguished panelists tonight were on the panel. Professor Hilary Mann Leverett, Ambassador John Limbert, Ambassador William Luers, and Professor Mohiaddin Mesbahi. They spoke at the event. In my opening remarks at that conference, I said this, and you will understand why I will quote myself. To get to our vision of an ideal US-Iran relationship, let's start by imagining. And I stress the word imagining, since political imagination should also be part of strategic thinking. Let's imagine the Middle East some years down the road and Iran's place in it. Nuclear weapons, a Middle East in which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. Israel is fully integrated within the family of the region's nations. Iraq is a full functioning sovereign democracy enjoying peace and security. Iran is recognized as a regional responsible power playing its full role in all fields, political, economic, cultural, both in the region and on the world stage. And because political and social disenfranchisement has been eliminated, extremism and violence have lost their appeal in this scenario, and remaining traces have been dealt with through the combined efforts of the region's nations. These nations also cooperate on the international stage on global issues including the environment, poverty, HIV/AIDS, and the world economy, among others. End of quotation. And I continued, and this vision Why would there be any reason for the United States and Iran to be separated, as they have in the last 30 years? What would feed the suspicion, demonization, tensions, and other expressions of enmity between the two nations? If we deem the vision that I just laid out preferable to the current state of Iran-US relationship, what steps could help us achieve such a vision? What would be the new paradigm governing US-Iran relations? End of quote. I then invited the panelists to share with us their insights on how to imagine this new paradigm and to make practical recommendations for its achievement. You can find the report on our website, www.centerfordialogues.org. These recommendations were not implemented. The enmity between the two nations that started with the hostage crisis of 1979 continued unabated until a few months ago. What happened a few months ago? Well, the election of Hassan Rouhani to the Iranian presidency and his outstretched hand to the US seem to have changed the parameters of this complex equation. President Obama, on his turn, responded positively. Hope, again, seems possible. Therefore, 5 years after the first conference on the issue, the NYU Center for Dialogues deemed the moment ripe for another reimagining of the relationship, another look at the possibility of a brighter future for US-Iran relations. Tonight, we will benefit from the academic expertise, diplomatic experience, and wisdom of Ambassador and Professor John Limbert, who will explain to us how the current US-Iran relationship evolved, Professor Flynt Leverett, who will share with us his views on Iranian priorities, Ambassador William Luers, who will look at the obstacles to cooperation between the two nations and offer ideas, we hope, on what changes needed to happen to overcome these obstacles. But all of these will remain dependent on trust. Without trust between the two sides, it will not be easy to achieve progress. And this is what Professor Mohiaddin Mesbahi will discuss. Finally, and you have seen this over the last few weeks in the press, the big picture, beyond the improvement of US-Iran relationship, what are the implications for the Middle East and beyond? This is what Professor Hilary Mann Leverett will address. Considering these core issues, I hope that the panelists will make policy recommendations for the future of the relationship. Their recommendations made today stand a better chance of being taken into account. Let us hope, together with the Iranian people, with the American people, the people of the Middle East and the world at large, that we will not have to wait 5 more years to see real progress and profound change in the relationship. Let me quote again: changing the paradigm from pessimism and tension to optimism, cooperation and mutual respect will not happen overnight, nor will it happen without planning, without a vision. Governments usually plan for catastrophes, environmental disasters, political turmoil, and military confrontations. Iran and the United States need to place greater emphasis on planning for improvements, for increased communication and cooperation that will make catastrophes less likely. So thank you for being here today. I hope you will leave feeling energized, encouraged, and equipped with ways to foster better US-Iranian relations in your own spheres of action. This was what I said at the end of the conference 5 years ago. These were the words with which I concluded my opening remarks at that time. I believe they are ever more relevant tonight. And so thank you also for coming tonight. We have split this evening program into two sessions. The first hour for panelists' presentations, and then we'll have 1 hour for Q&A. So without any further ado, I give the floor to Ambassador Limbert. You have the floor.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Tlili, for what you do at this at the Center for Dialogue. I think you have maybe sold yourself short a little bit. Think about where we were 5 years ago and the kinds of things that you did 5 years ago. Maybe just now we're seeing them bearing fruit. And what we're seeing today is in part a result of your good work in bringing people together. Now, I've been given what's probably, I think, a very difficult question, and that is, why did the current U.S.-Iranian relationship evolve? Why has it changed? Well, let's assume first that it has changed. But answering the why requires a knowledge of motive and psychology that's way beyond me. I mean, I'm a simple university professor. What do I know about motives and psychology, or why people do the things they do? In diplomacy as well, we are trained to deal with results and with actions, and to avoid assigning motives to others. For if we do, we can mislead ourselves by bad assumptions, and sometimes we end up turning over rocks that probably shouldn't be turned over. Over 7 centuries ago, the poet Sa'di of Shiraz gave us wise advice about delving into other people's motives. He said, "Har ke ra jam'e parsa bini, parsa dano nikmardingar," means whomever you see in the robes of an ascetic, consider him an ascetic and assume that he is virtuous. So perhaps the question should be, has the U.S. relationship evolved into something different and something better than what it has been for the last 34 years? I hope so. I'm not sure we're there yet. What I am sure of, though, is something is changing. Now, thanks to my 8-year-old granddaughter, I have recently rediscovered the magic of Narnia, and C.S. Lewis's Narnia. That land where the White Witch put a spell on the land so there would always be winter and never Christmas. Well, U.S.-Iranian relations have suffered from a similar spell and a hard freeze that's lasted 34 years. And in that hard freeze, those few exchanges that we had consisted mostly of trading insults, trading threats, and sometimes even worse. Now, it looks like the freeze is breaking, and both sides are moving over very slippery ground without reliable maps and maybe without a clear destination. That lack of destination for me is a problem. Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland reminds us in probably what is the best book ever written about U.S.-Iranian relations. He says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. The spell that froze relations was cast 34 years ago, and it was part of it was cast in this city, just a few subway stops away, in this month, in 1979, when the American Secretary of State met his Iranian counterpart on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And that meeting, which was the last meeting between foreign ministers of the two countries until this recent Kerry Zarif meeting, frankly, it was a disaster. What happened? Well, when Secretary of State Vance spoke to his Iranian counterpart, Dr. Ibrahim Yazdi, he asked him to share ideas about how the relationship could move forward after the profound changes in Iran, changes that had happened less than a year earlier. Yazdi's reply was simply to recite a list of Iranian complaints against the United States. Now, Secretary Vance, who was ever the patient diplomat, acknowledged these grievances and repeated his question, how do we move forward? And Foreign Minister Yazdi repeated his answer. America did this and America did that. Well, Secretary Vance, perhaps failing to appreciate Yazdi's political vulnerability at home at the time, simply left the meeting in complete disgust. That 1979 unfortunate encounter has set the pattern for 34 years of frost and futility. I, for one, think that these recent changes in tone and approach from both sides are very significant. At long last, Hassan is talking to Hussein. Both sides are rediscovering the tools of diplomacy, which have lain rusty and disused for over 3 decades, somewhere in the back of their tool sheds. Now, I'm not certain that the two sides will be able in the end to use this new and positive tone to build a relationship that serves the interests of both, in which the two sides talk to each other, if not as friends, then at least as states with important matters to discuss, something we have not been able to do with the Islamic Republic for 34 years. Let's go back to the original question then. Has the relationship changed? Well, it hasn't yet. Although changing the tone of our exchanges is indeed a vital step. But will that change of tone bring better relations? In this case, as our Iranian friends like to say, as dohal kharij nist. It either will or it won't. There are only two possibilities. I speak about neglected tools. If we're going to build on these recent positive steps, we're going to have to relearn how to use those tools, when for so long the only tool we had was a sledgehammer. Essentially, there are three tools that have grown rusty after 3 decades of neglect. They are, first, listening to what the other side says and understanding its goals and concerns, sometimes behind what may be a screen of words. The second is patience, having enough patience to understand that we've embarked on a difficult road and there will be setbacks and problems. This new reality, for me, is like a very delicate plant that must receive very careful and specific care. It cannot be neglected, it cannot be overwatered, it will die if it's not treated with great care. Third is having control of language, avoiding words that imply contempt that imply arrogance and that clash with claims that one desires to engage with the other side on the basis of mutual respect. Unfortunately, we've seen too much of this destructive language in the last 30 years. In this new setting, we must choose our words very carefully and think before we speak. Well, finally, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from my learned colleagues here at the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's your turn
Thank
to
you.
tell us about the Iranian priorities, which you know.
Thank you very, very much.
Your book was an expression of your knowledge of these priorities.
Yes. All right.
Here it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Before I take up the topic of Iranian priorities in any realignment of relations with the United States, I think it's important to consider the essential conditions for such realignment from an Iranian point of view. Those conditions have been defined most authoritatively by Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the Islamic Republic's supreme leader. In recent years, Karim Sajadpour, Ray Takei, other analysts who frankly hate the Islamic Republic and want it to disappear have engaged in what I think is an intellectually dishonest misreading of Khamenei's rhetoric to portray him and indeed the entire Islamic Republic as dependent for their very survival on antagonism with America. This is flat out false. From Khamenei's days as the Islamic Republic's president in the 1980s, he has been open to improve relations with the United States. As early as 1984, following what he said was the expressed wish of Imam Khomeini, Khamenei defined Tehran's foreign policy as, quote, an open door. Iran, he said, would seek rational, sound, and healthy relations with all countries, including America. When he came to New York in 1987 to address the UN General Assembly, then President Khamenei told an Iranian newspaper, again, quote, certainly there are conditions where ties to the United States could be normalized. What are those conditions? During his presidency and since he succeeded Imam Khomeini as the Islamic Republic's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei and the 4 Iranian presidents elected over the course of Khamenei's now 24-year tenure as leader have all said repeatedly that Iran is open to better relations with the United States, but only on the basis of mutual respect, equality, and American acceptance of the Islamic Republic as an enduring and legitimate political entity representing legitimate national interests. Those are the conditions: mutual respect, equality, and American acceptance. To be sure, Ayatollah Khamenei has grown increasingly skeptical over the years that the United States will ever be willing to come to terms with the Islamic Republic on this basis. There's a substantial history feeding this skepticism, which we can discuss in the Q&A if you like. A history during Khamenei's tenure as leader of actually quite substantial Iranian cooperation with the United States on issues where Washington asked for Iranian assistance, and of Iranian overtures to the United States. In all of these instances of cooperation and outreach, the United States either pocketed Iranian cooperation that Washington had asked for and then intensified hostility toward the Islamic Republic, or else the United States just responded with intensified hostility. Notwithstanding this history and the deep skepticism it generates in Iran, skepticism about American intentions toward the Islamic Republic, Khamenei has, more than anyone else in Iranian political life, defined the fundamental Iranian position, one of openness to improved relations with the United States, but again, only in an atmosphere of mutual respect equality, and American acceptance. This position, Hillary and I argue in our book, Going to Tehran, is one of the strongest consensus positions in all of Iranian foreign policy, and it very much shapes Iranian priorities in the current diplomatic environment. Tehran's #1 foreign policy priority, whether there's U.S.-Iranian rapprochement or not, is for the Islamic Republic to develop as an independent power. This notion of independence is crucial. From its inception, the Islamic Republic has been fundamentally unwilling to subordinate its strategic orientation to American preferences, like, say, Egypt did under Sadat and Mubarak. Conversely, the notion that the Islamic Republic is hell-bent on regional hegemony and will use rapprochement with the United States to consolidate an increasingly dominant position in the Middle East is also mistaken. Pursuing regional hegemony in collaboration with the United States was the Shah's foreign policy. It's not the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. The Islamic Republic is a paradigmatic example of a state pursuing what Hillary and I call a counter-hegemonic foreign policy. Its goal is foreign policy independence, not hegemony. So if the United States can come to terms with the Islamic Republic as an independent power, fine. If not, the Islamic Republic isn't going to sacrifice its strategic independence and autonomy to win Washington's approval. In the context of the nuclear issue, this emphasis on independence means that for Tehran, a diplomatic settlement can be reached only on the basis of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. A settlement cannot be reached on the basis of UN Security Council resolutions calling on the Islamic Republic to suspend uranium enrichment. Those resolutions violate Iran's rights as both a sovereign state and as an NPT signatory. By extension, they also violate UN Charter provisions directing that the Security Council act only, quote, in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations and with the present Charter. For these reasons, these resolutions are, from Tehran's perspective, illegal and invalid. Moreover, the first of these resolutions from 2006, on which all the subsequent resolutions are based, reflects an assessment of Tehran's intent to build nuclear weapons that America's own intelligence community repudiated in 2007. This repudiation nullifies the legal basis for all 7 resolutions calling on Iran to suspend enrichment. Likewise, a settlement cannot be reached on the basis of Israeli and, at least intermittently, U.S. demands that Iran simply dismantle its nuclear infrastructure, especially its fuel cycle infrastructure, demands which also violate its nuclear rights and its sovereignty. A settlement can only be reached on the basis of the NPT. This means that a settlement will necessarily recognize Iran's nuclear rights as a sovereign state and as an NPT signatory, especially its right to enrich uranium under international safeguards. That's why there is, in fact, enormously broad support internationally for Iran's position on this issue. Just 4 countries in the world deny that the NPT includes within its Article 4 and 5 provisions that all signatories have, quote, an inalienable right to use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes without discrimination. Those 4 countries are the United States, Britain, France, and Israel, which isn't even an NPT signatory. That's it. Strikingly, Washington once held the right to peaceful use includes the indigenous development of safeguarded fuel cycle capabilities. In 1968, as America and the Soviet Union, the NPT's co-sponsors, prepared to open it for signature, U.S. officials told Congress that the treaty permitted non-weapon states to pursue the fuel cycle. Since the Cold War's end, though, the United States, along with Britain, France, and Israel, has been determined to constrain the diffusion of fuel cycle capabilities to non-Western states. Their main motive has been to maximize America's freedom of unilateral military initiative, and in the Middle East, that of Israel. In contrast, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the non-aligned movement, with 120 countries representing nearly 2/3 of UN members who recently elected the Islamic Republic as their head, have unequivocally recognized Iran's right, as well as that of other non-weapon states, to develop safeguarded indigenous fuel cycle capabilities. The Islamic Republic, and with it, the non-Western world, virtually in its entirety, wants a solution to the nuclear issue grounded in the NPT, not only because that will guarantee Iran's nuclear rights, and at least implicitly the rights of other non-Western states pursuing indigenous fuel cycle capabilities, but also because such a solution constrains assertions of hegemonic prerogative by the United States, either unilaterally or with a few European and Israeli hangers-on. The proposal for resolving the nuclear issue that Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif presented in Geneva earlier this month seeks to operationalize the idea of a diplomatic settlement grounded in the NPT. It reflects an approach advocated by Hassan Rouhani and other Iranian leaders for over a decade. Greater transparency on Iran's nuclear activities in return for recognition of its rights as a sovereign NPT signatory, especially to enrich under international safeguards. The main difference between Rouhani and Ahmadinejad is not some different sense of what the Islamic Republic's interests and diplomatic priorities are. The main difference is that Ahmadinejad was skeptical about the suitability of current international structures, the Security Council, international regimes like the NPT, to constrain assertions of superpower hegemony by the United States. Rouhani, by contrast, is more inclined to see international law, as for example the NPT, as an essential tool for constraining extra-legal superpower behavior. Thus, the Iranian package put forward in Geneva by Dr. Zarif seeks proactively to provide greater transparency on Tehran's nuclear activities. We can discuss the details in the Q&A if you like. Based on conversations with Iranian officials and political figures during a visit to Tehran earlier this month, Hillary and I think we can also identify items that the Iranian approach almost certainly does not include. Ayatollah Khamenei has reportedly given President Rouhani and his diplomats flexibility in negotiating a settlement to the nuclear issue, but he has also directed that they not compromise Iran's sovereignty. Thus, the Islamic Republic will not acquiesce to American and Israeli demands to suspend enrichment, shut its enrichment site at Fordo, stop a heavy water reactor under construction at Arak, and ship its current uranium stockpile, enriched uranium stockpile abroad. They will, as part of a settlement, ratify and implement the additional protocol, providing for more proactive and intrusive inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They will be willing to stop enriching at 20% of fissile isotope purity needed to fuel the Tehran research reactor and cap enrichment at levels suitable for fueling power reactors. They're also open to capping the number of centrifuges that Iran would install, at least for some years, at its enrichment sites at Natanz and Fordo. A diplomatic settlement to the nuclear issue predicated on the NPT would also entail a lifting of sanctions against Iran, including not just the multilateral sanctions authorized by the UN Security Council, which aren't all that significant in their impact, frankly, but also US unilateral sanctions and especially US secondary sanctions. These are the sanctions that threaten to punish third country entities in the United States, not for anything they've done here, but for perfectly lawful business they conduct in or with the Islamic Republic. Such secondary sanctions are universally condemned outside the United States, even in Europe, as grossly illegal. They clearly violate US obligations under the World Trade Organization. If the United States ever actually imposed such sanctions on a major European or Chinese company and got taken to the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism, it would lose the case. But the United States does this anyway. If the Obama administration wants to do a nuclear deal with Iran based on the NPT, it will not find a better set of interlocutors than President Rouhani, Dr. Zarif, and Zarif's deputies. If the administration is not prepared to reach such a deal, because it's not willing to accept Iran's nuclear rights, or more broadly, to accept the Islamic Republic as an enduring entity representing legitimate national interests, or if Congress is not prepared to let the administration implement such a deal, then Tehran will leverage this failure to show the world that the United States is a failing and flailing superpower, and that it is the United States that's the problem, not the Islamic Republic. And they will use that to reduce the willingness of other countries to continue accommodating the United States on economically dysfunctional and, in most instances, illegal sanctions that, it is becoming ever clearer, are not related in any instrumentally rational way to promoting a diplomatic opening with the Islamic Republic, but are really about some other agenda which most of the international community has no inclination to support. And so I think what the Iranians are trying to do in these negotiations is to create literally a moment of truth for the United States and for other important players in the international community. And we will see how President Obama deals with that moment of truth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Flynt. Bill,
Sure.
your turn.
Thank you, Dr. Tlili, for doing this. You've done a lot over the years, as John Limbert pointed out, to help us all think clearly, more clearly than we have before, about these issues. John Limbert is the sort of symbol of the bad period, and he continues to come back to, because he was a hostage, because he has dealt over the years with Iranians. He continues to retain, despite the trouble he went through as a hostage, and subsequently trying to get sensibility, retaining no hostility toward these people who held him. He's been an outstanding example for all of us, and I'm certainly for me. Flynt and Hillary have played a role in this debate that is invaluable, in the sense that they tell it with passion like it is, and they make judgments about who's right and who's wrong, and by and large, I think much of what they've said and what Flynt does so comprehensively is describe a value world in which Iran has been a victim, and we have not understood that relationship. My job today is to talk about obstacles, and I guess I'm not going to be very helpful, because most of my career, the last 13 years rather, has been dedicated to trying to eliminate obstacles and at least obscure them. I guess I begin with a quote from Archibald MacLeish, who wrote in the preamble to the to UNESCO Charter, since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that the structures of peace must be built. That was before there were women. And I'll say that this is a fundamental obstacle in the relationship. It's in the minds of the people running both countries and in the societies. And that's why the Iran project, which I'm directing, has been devoting much of the last 5 or 6 years to dealing with specific minds of specific men. And we have devoted a lot of time to seeing, in the last 6 months, we've seen about 30 senators personally, one-on-one. We've written 3 important reports, which included the signed by some 35 or 40 top American national security specialists, including mostly Brent Scowcroft and Brzezinski, and we try to make it bipartisan. And we've written a lot of op-eds, as have Hillary and Flynt. But I guess our approach, slightly different from what the Leveretts have done, is to try to relate our concerns about the obstacles to U.S.-Iranian relations to the mentality of the people we're talking to. We have cast our lot on the side of supporting the U.S. government and hoping that on the margin it will get it right. And so, because of our approach, we've had access to practically everybody we want to see, and regular access. So the process has been to say, look, what we're looking at is not who's right and who's wrong. It's what is in the interest of the United States, national security interests. And I think we have tried to argue that the approach we're taking may have done something in the past to reflect our anxiety and anger over this Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran. But it has not succeeded in protecting our interests if our interests are to have a non-nuclear armed Iran. Now, whether they want to be armed with nuclear weapons or not is beside the point right now, because most Americans are convinced that is what they want. Most Americans in power. You would find very few senators in Washington who wouldn't down deep be convinced that what the Iranians want is a nuclear weapon. So somehow you have to persuade them that let's make it very difficult for Iran to get nuclear weapons. And here's how you do it. And so our approach has been to try to accept the biases in the minds of those men and work with them to change them, to reduce to enlarge their understanding of what we believe is happening, and to get them to think about alternative ways of approaching Iran. There are large obstacles. I would say, aside from the psychology, which I think is so fundamental, there is the fact that we have a large military presence all around them, that they consider us having surrounded them by putting troops in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf. And it's not just that they're victims of paranoia, because we have surrounded them militarily. But the other side of that is that we also made them a great power. By eliminating Taliban and Saddam Hussein, suddenly they emerge as the country in the region with not only a large, old, united country, but a country that dominates most of the other region except for Turkey and Israel. So I guess I'm of mixed minds about how much they should feel victims of our presence in getting rid of their enemies. But that's certainly one reason why they feel that why they find it difficult to talk to us. The fact that we've surrounded them and frankly threatened them. I'm absolutely convinced that when we were in Iraq, the Iranians believed that the next domino was going to be Iran, and that we saw that clearly. Many people in the U.S. government saw that clearly. So this other aspect of surrounding them is a second obstacle. A third obstacle is the political attitudes of both governments. I guess I would argue that each side has similar problems with the other. Starting with the domestic political situation on both sides. Unquestionably, because of the pathology of American Congress and sort of leadership, there's very little knowledge of what this country is. We have virtually no experts in the U.S. government, certainly not in the Senate. And this has been part of my frustration for many decades as a diplomat and other functions. When you deal with the United States, when the United States tries to deal with another country, you have to assume that the Senate's going to know very little about that country. I dealt with the Soviet Union for about 25 years, and I do believe that over time we learned something about the Soviet Union, principally because we were really worried that they were going to eliminate us with nuclear weapons. And that focuses the mind, and it did eventually focus the mind in the case of the Soviet Union. And that's in part, I think, why Bush and subsequent leaders have used, and certainly Netanyahu has used the nuclear threat as a way to focus the mind against Iran. And from the Iranian side, I guess I would argue that their internal structure has been every bit as hostile to the United States as we have toward them, partially government propaganda, partially this history of feeling the victim of American power. A lot of it, lack of access to what we're really about, except for people like Javad Zarif, who got their PhD here in this country, and so many of the leaders of the current government had it there. So and clearly internally, a large presence of Iran in the Middle East is managed by Soleimani and the Quds Force. There's a military presence, whether it's the dominant presence in the Middle East for Iran or an important factor. But the Quds Force, which is an arm of the Revolutionary Guard, headed by Soleimani, who was probably their most distinguished foreign operator outside of the most important foreign operator outside of the government itself, is not always in line with what the president of Iran would like to have happen, and undermines, I think, Iran's ability to conduct diplomacy in the region. Israel is a factor, and how do you play that? How do you talk about it? It's very difficult in this country to talk candidly about the role Israel plays in our politics of the region or in the thinking of senators. But AIPAC, which is one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington, I mean, when we go to see senators, it's clear that AIPAC has been there just before us and will follow immediately after us. And there's a presence of, and I understand the argument about Israel's security. No American would not want to make sure that the United States favors Israel's security. But the thought that Iran, if it gets one little dirty weapon, will drop it on a country, will drop it on Tel Aviv, a country which has 250 nuclear weapons armed and ready to go, is absurd. And the ability of the Israeli government to argue the case that that the Holocaust could come if, in fact, Iran gets a nuclear weapon, I think is not credible to me, and yet it's credible to many members of the U.S. Senate. I probably shouldn't have been as candid as I was, but I do believe that the Netanyahu factor is a big factor in the way Americans think about, and the U.S. Congress thinks about Iran. I guess I'd say that leadership is also a factor. The Supreme Leader has always been extremely skeptical of the United States. He's followed his predecessor's revolutionary ideal, and certainly his belief that we were a major part of the problem. And it's interesting that you mentioned Karim Sajadpour, who's obsessed by the Supreme Leader. As you know, he's changed his mind. I heard that yesterday. Because there's enough out there that suggests that there's a new world, as I think John Limbert was saying. But until the leadership in Iran makes a decision that they're prepared to take big risks to unravel this terrible history we've had, there won't be a change. I believe that he's made that decision, and he's going to wait and see how we react. And Rouhani is reflecting that decision. The United States is another thing. I think Obama has, and his White House staff, and certainly John Kerry, have realized and been surprised by the degree to which Iran is prepared to make significant concessions on their nuclear program, as I think was outlined by Flynt. They're prepared to go a long way to satisfy the concerns of the United States and the rest of the international community that they are not, do not plan to develop a nuclear weapon. The problem is that to get there, the United States has to make some major decisions on sanctions. And I can't for the life of me figure out how the president is going to make a sufficient and comparable response to the Iranian offer. The biggest problem is the banking sanctions, which are not, as Flynt said, under the UN resolutions. They're a unilateral extraterritorial restriction on all the world's banks for dealing with Iran. And once they've been levied, and they fine banks throughout the world, the US Treasury fines banks in foreign countries for trading with Iran. Most banks are now reluctant, under any circumstances, to use cash, Iranian cash, to buy products for Iran. And that's a problem. Now, whether the president can take the action necessary to lift those sanctions is uncertain. Presumably he has found a way to do it. But the economy in Iran's economy will not improve until they can get those sanctions lifted and they can begin to trade. And I guess I worry that we will go to the Iranians and say, we'll do this, we'll suspend them for temporarily. But the banks won't play that game. Banks want long-term commitment. They can't make any deals if they get assurances that in a month and a half we won't fine them. They're not going to give lines of credit. Some banking relationship take years to spend off the credit. So it will be interesting to see to what degree the President of the United States will say, we want this deal, and I'm prepared to go to the Senate of the United States and say, I think we have to make substantial shift in the limitations that we've placed on the banks around the world to trade. Oil relief will not do the trick. The Europeans can do a lot, but not enough. And now is the time when the president is going to have to commit to a significant change over the next several months, at least a year. He's got to say, we're going to let you trade and we're going to lift these sanctions on banks. So,
well, thank you.
no.
Thank you very much. This was very enlightening and clear. We turn now to Mohiaddin Mesbahi. Professor Mesbahi will build on this and on the necessity of trust to arrive somewhere in improving the relationship. Without that,
thank you for inviting me and dragging me out of Latin America and bringing from Miami to New York, and also putting me on the edge of the table, 4+1 conspiracy to put me out of the.
Give him a shout, John.
So no, I'm just funny. My comments. I wrote a long piece on trust last spring, and it was published before President Rouhani came, and it's widely read in Iran and other places, and so on. So I don't want to go through that extensive discussion of the question of trust, and I'm not going to mention policy issues because that's been addressed by my learned colleagues here. but perhaps maybe comments on a larger trends and dynamics which frames the negotiation between Iran and the United States and obviously affects the notion of trust, or elements of trust or mistrust that any negotiation eventually has to contemplate. And I divide them into four broad themes, and I'm going to maybe belabor on one of them more than others. One is the impact of the bilateral relationship and the long-term perception of each other on the question of trust. Second is what I call strategic culture. I think the two countries have distinctly different strategic culture, and different strategic cultures have different implications for how you approach a negotiation, diplomacy, and of course how trust is being framed within the strategic culture. Third, I'm going to talk about the impact of balance of power on the question of trust, and how the balance of power or absence of it or presence of it is going to affect diplomacy and trust. And then finally, I'm going to maybe address the question whether the contemporary policy of containment has run its course or not, whether we are in a process of exhausting that paradigm or not. And then using these four broad themes to really frame the issue of negotiations, diplomacy, and trust without talking about the specific details of what's going on in Tehran today or Washington. I think in terms of questions of bilateral relations and its implication, there are a couple of issues. One is that the genealogy of the conflict itself is heavily ideologically framed and emotively charged, sequentially, first by the Iranians perhaps, and then by the Americans. And I think we have not stopped doing that from the beginning. Second is the longevity of this conflict and the fact that this is a very long conflict and actually goes to before the 1979. For the Iranian elite, it goes to 1953 perhaps, building on a contrarian view of the United States, which was full of trust and hope that the United States as a young republic would counter the old British fox and the Russians, and then the Americans proved them to be wrong in 1953 on. What is interesting about this impact of the history is and how the Iranians look at the question of trust and the U.S. identity. The Iranian approach is actually more modern in some sense, more political, it's ideological. They look at the United States as a superpower, as an imperial power, as the terminology which they use as an arrogant power. Therefore, the interpretation of the United States is rather modern. The United States interpretation, it is ideological, but it's also heavily traditional. That is, there is a heavy dose of Orientalism in shaping their mindset about the Iranians. The comment which was made in fleeting moment by the American negotiator about the Iranians' DNA, it is not accidental. It is contextually framed. If you look at the travel logs, the American diplomatic memoirs about how they deal with the Iranians, with the Shah, with Khomeini, before Khomeini. I'm sorry?
Tell them what you referred to.
Well, in the Senate, I think it was the Senate hearings, that the American negotiator basically, when they asked him, how could you, deal with the Iranians, and of course you have to watch for the Iranians, she mentioned that, of course, deception is in DNA. That is, when the Iranians are genetically are prone to be deceptive and so on. Of course, later on they said it's not exactly what she said, but it's not accidental. I've documented that stuff in my article, actually, that this goes very deep, this orientalization of Iranians and the Easterners in general, had a huge impact on how the Americans psychologically frame others, and especially the Middle Easterns when it comes to negotiations. Therefore, if you go to the Congress, it's the same thing. If you talk to the American commentators, it's the same thing. The Iranians, for example, they're good chess players, and they always look for the, of course they are not, of course, terrible chess players, and so on. But that Orientalism is, I think, is a significant factor in terms of not only shaping the view, but also facilitating branding which is critical in propaganda, obviously, in avoiding negotiations, for example. Because branding is key in terms of securitization language. And I'm sorry I'm talking a little bit in scholarly language here because there are a lot of our students here sitting here and they might be interested in that. Second, related to that is a distinct strategic cultural differences in terms of how they approach the use of force. It's a complicated topic. I know Ambassador Luers perhaps remembers that during the Soviet period, there was a lot of discussions about the strategic culture, how the United States was different from the Soviet Union, how the Soviet Union was offensively oriented, and how the United States was different, and so on. It has made an interesting comeback in the academia, especially in framing the questions of trust. The consensus among the American policy and analysts of the United States foreign policy is that the United States has developed a high propensity of using coercive tool or coercive language in shaping its foreign policy. The latest work by Andrew Basovich on the militarization of the American foreign policy, which he argues that is deeply also embedded in the militarization of American society, actually, in looking at the world and quickly thinking about that because you have military muscle, you can resolve the problems. That's a prevailing strategic culture like in the United States, and of course it's heavily influencing the approach towards Iran, and therefore the constant reminder that every option is on the table. In terms of negotiations, the Americans have a tendency of looking at the conflict resolution as a zero-sum game, and therefore pretty good at a prisoner's dilemma, and therefore defection when it comes to make decisions. I think this constant tendency to defect from the moment of the truth when a concession is needed, it also points to another interesting element of American strategic culture, which has a very low threshold of risk-taking in negotiations. It has difficult time for costly signaling, as it's called in techniques of negotiation, actually. Because the domestic cost is always so high. Also, it's not becoming of the United States a great power to make concessions and so on. So American exceptionalism has something to do with that, obviously, in framing the American approach towards negotiations. So it's not unnatural, actually, for the American diplomats to go to negotiations and perceive that their position is completely correct and morally right. It's not even cynical, actually. And this is what I discuss in my paper, that there's something peculiar about the American hubris, which is very innocent, actually. It's not necessarily Machiavellian. It is pretty organic. It is natural. And therefore, the expectations is when people question them, they're kind of surprised and offended by the question. I think this creates a lot of resiliency against education, against looking to the other side's positions and so on, because Americans normally get genuinely offended by being questioned that they're not really interested in security or they're interested in dominations and so on. So negotiations become a place for pontification. Yes, the Iranians do the same thing because they have learned to talk about their grievances and all that. But the American position is also not too far. The Iranian strategic culture is mostly defensively oriented, but it is resistance based. And I think here the points about independence is critical. That's the jewels of the crown of the revolution. And it would not be compromised or negotiated away, regardless of actually who was in charge in Iran and which faction would come to power in the country. Therefore, that strategy is based on resilience, resistance by all costs. Sometimes they're actually so intense about that they miscalculate their options and their vulnerabilities and so on. But in broad terms, the Iranians, to use a technical terms, they are not into prisoner's dilemma, they are assurance game. They like to assure the other side. And I think their approach towards the Americans have been very interesting and fascinating. They have been much more willing to take risk, although they are the lesser power, and therefore any mistakes by them could be fatal. But they have been they have shown much more propensity to take risk. And this runs through almost every single administration, regardless of ideological orientations. Rafsanjani did it with the hostage crisis in Lebanon. He trusted the Americans. And what's fascinating about this trusting the American is that they never asked for a reciprocity in concrete terms. They actually expect a great power will do the right thing. That's a very interesting psychological makeup that the Iranians bring to the table. In spite of all of their accusation against the United States, they always somehow expect that the Americans are the great power, as a self-proclaimed great power, to actually do what they say they will do. And therefore, they never really negotiate a concrete tit for tat. And I think this could actually have an impact on these negotiations. They may ask for a concrete tit for tat. I'm not sure about that, but that's a possibility. It happened under Khatami, even after happened under Ahmadinejad, you know, the Brazil and Turkey deal and so on and so forth. And it would happen with Rouhani. Perhaps one critical reason for this trusting and risking trust is that the Iranians are not necessarily interested in issue-oriented conflict resolution. They are interested in perhaps a grand accommodation of some sort. So they want to know the end game, where we're going with this. And the Americans, out of habit or choice here, they are problem solvers, issue-oriented. You know, let's solve this problem, and then it's human rights, and then this and that. And I don't think the Iranians are really interested in that game. The third factor, which I think is the most critical factor in framing the question of negotiations and diplomacy, which I'm going to talk about perhaps a bit more, and I think the education of the American side on this one is absolutely critical, is the assessment of the balance of power between the two countries. Because the imbalance of power creates a condition that one side does not necessarily need to trust on the other side. If you're powerful, why should you trust anybody? You ask for them, you demand them. I understand. Give me just a couple more minutes to finish this. Yes, there is a major imbalance of power between the two sides. The Iranians are no match for the United States military or economic or even political power. On the other hand, what it has existed and we have today is what I have called in that article is an asymmetrical balance of power, an effective balance of power. An asymmetrical effective balance of power as such that has made the use of military force questionable, ambiguous, very costly, and uncertain. It is in that context that you have to look at the Iranian election of 2013. The 2009 election and its controversy, as the Iranian leaders themselves have admitted, was a big setback for Iran and a strategic gift to the United States. The gift was taken back in June of 2013. There is a major repairment of relations between the state and society in Iran. The government has basically brought back a good section of the population into the fore. Therefore, Rouhani's approach towards the United States comes within a significant improvement in this asymmetrical balance of power. And it has two dimensions to it. One is external, that is image of Iran abroad, as was discussed. It would make the sanction against Iran more costly. But second and more important, and that is the key for Washington to understand and be educated, is it has made Iran's position domestically a legitimate foundation for foreign policy. So the blame would be on the United States, not on the Iranian government, if the negotiation fails in Iran. And therefore, the Iranians are actually in a comfortable mental position, not a materially comfortable position, but a mentally comfortable position. They have done their best, they will do their best, and they look to see if the United States wants to make a concession, humiliation, and defeat, which would be unacceptable, or a compromise. And I think that's the key factor. They have made the regime change impossible, and therefore they basically have questioned and called off the military option.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, now, Hillary, how does the region look at all of this, what are the implications for the Middle East? We have seen lately some anxiety all over the place, from Saudi Arabia to Israel. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tlili, for hosting us, everyone for coming, my distinguished colleagues. It really is a pleasure to be with you here today. And it is truly fitting to follow Professor Mesbahi on this panel, because in a lot of ways, Flynt and I are from the belly of the beast. We both entered, me the State Department, he the CIA, in 1990 when the U.S. first decided to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops to the Middle East, what we call the imperial turn in American foreign policy in the Middle East. And we were part of decision-making at state, CIA and White House, and Republican and Democratic administrations from that then until after the invasion of Iraq, when we finally resigned, because as Ambassador Luers said, we at this point are pretty no holds bar in terms of what we think is right or wrong. We spent a long time in the U.S. government analyzing these issues, going over these issues, and seeing a lot of the damage and destruction that was done. We also saw some of the things that the United States could do constructively. So, for example, I'm one of the few U.S. diplomats to have ever negotiated seriously, constructively, and regularly with Iranian officials in the wake of 9/11 over Afghanistan. We met with them from 2001 to 2003 regularly to coordinate strategy and policy over Afghanistan in an extremely constructive way. There's this idea out there that we always had tens of thousands of troops in Afghanistan. No, we started with 100 CIA officers, 350 special forces, and maybe 2,000 altogether with air power. It was we working with Iran, Russia, and India and the Northern Alliance that they had trained, fed, and clothed that was able to overthrow the Taliban and send al-Qaeda on the run from Afghanistan. We did that, and then the Iranians were met with the axis of evil speech by the person I worked for, President Bush at the time, and I was a career non-political appointee to the White House at that time. And I say that as a preface to my remarks about the region, because I think, as Professor Mesbahi pointed out, this looking at the region, American diplomats and academics will tell you, straight face, Iranians think this, Iranians think that. They've never met with Iranian officials. They've never met with people who live to this day and support the Islamic Republic of Iran, as do the majority of Iranians in that country. Now, there certainly is a large diaspora who have left Iran, who hate the Islamic Republic and want to see it fail. Just like there were Chinese who came here who wanted to see the People's Republic of China fail, as there were Iraqi defectors who came here and wanted to see Saddam Hussein overthrown. We don't take a view on whether the Iranian government is good or bad, but we do take a view on our government not letting our people hear and talk to Iranians or Iraqis or Chinese themselves. And so for Wendy Sherman, our lead negotiator with the Iranians, who had met one time with one Iranian official, and he happens to be one of the most distinguished, he has his PhD from the University of Denver, to then come out and say in front of Congress that the problem with the Iranians is that deception is in their DNA, when she had one meeting with them, it tells us that the hegemonic lens by which we look at the Middle East and Iran in particular is quite thick. And that's where I come to what's going to be my first of 4 points tonight. And that is that I think the most immediate and potentially consequential implication of real improved relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran would be that for the first time in generations, we would have the serious prospect of ending America's post-Cold War quest for hegemony in the Middle East, a quest that has done such profound damage to America's standing in that region and globally, and to hundreds of millions of people throughout the Muslim world. Just as Sino-American realignment 40 years ago was predicated on the United States abandoning its failed and counterproductive drive to dominate strategically vital Asia and accepting that the United States would henceforth operate in that environment shaped by multilateral balancing among the United States and key regional powers in Asia, not by American hegemony, a real U.S. opening to the Islamic Republic of Iran will be predicated on America's ending of its hegemonic ambitions in the Middle East. To do this, it is critical for the United States to have productive relations with all of the key players in the Middle East balance. And in today's Middle East, this absolutely includes the Islamic Republic of Iran. On this issue of hegemony versus balance, I want to quote for you the single most critical sentence from the 1972 Shanghai Communique that set forth the framework for Sino-American rapprochement. And it said this, quote, "Neither side should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony." For 20 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the United States could not accept the reality of a Chinese political order that refused to subordinate its foreign policies to American preferences. So for 20 years, Washington tried to isolate the People's Republic of China diplomatically and to strangle it economically. We didn't just support regime change for the People's Republic of China, we supported a whole alternative political structure on Taiwan as the quote-unquote real China. And the results were disastrous for the United States. Trying to undermine the People's Republic of China actually undermined the American position in Asia and got us into the tragic quagmire of Vietnam. Then President Nixon had the strategic insight and the political acumen to fundamentally recast America's Asia policy so that it would actually serve U.S. interests. First and foremost, by coming to terms with the fiercely independent political order established by the Chinese Revolution in 1949. By doing so, President Nixon saved America's position in Asia and restored the United States as a great power capable of proactively shaping critical strategic outcomes through smart diplomacy, something we've become very rusty at. And today, it is this kind of smart diplomacy toward the Islamic Republic of Iran that is absolutely essential to arresting America's strategic deterioration in the Middle East and restoring our global position. But it will require the United States abandoning its failed and counterproductive drive for hegemony in the Middle East, and to accept the Islamic Republic, as Flynt said, as an enduring political entity representing legitimate national interests and as an independent regional power unwilling to subordinate its foreign policies to American preferences. My second point is how various regional actors in the Middle East feel about this depends overwhelmingly on how they feel about American hegemony in the Middle East. Two countries, Israel and Saudi Arabia, both long-standing U.S. allies, are very anxious, as Professor Tlili highlighted, about a prospective U.S.-Iranian rapprochement. Their anxiety is often expressed as concern over the Islamic Republic's emergence as a regional hegemon. But that is fundamentally misleading. As Flynt pointed out, collaborating with Washington to be the regional hegemon was the Shah's foreign policy. It is not the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. The Islamic Republic is a paradigm of what we would call counter-hegemonic foreign policy. As a matter of policy, the Islamic Republic aspires to be the Middle East's leading nation, economically, scientifically, technologically. But the Islamic Republic's foreign policy and national security strategy is fundamentally defensive, with the overarching goal of ensuring the Islamic Republic's safety and security, defined in terms of national independence and territorial and political integrity. The Islamic Republic's strategic objective is not hegemony, but in fact a regional order in which hegemony is not achievable. To the extent the Islamic Republic has been able to expand its regional influence, it has done so by supporting indigenous resistance to the hegemonic initiatives of others, and by supporting political forces in their environment capable of winning popular legitimization through elections. Look at Iraq. The Shia Islamist and Kurdish parties that have been the heart of every elected Iraqi government since Saddam Hussein's overthrow were supported for decades during Saddam Hussein's era and after by the Islamic Republic of Iran. The secularists that Washington sought to impose on post-Saddam's Iraq and the model of continued Sunni dominance of Iraq favored by Saudi Arabia lost. Those two models, secularism and Sunni dominance, lost. They lost not because of the Islamic Republic's assertion of hegemony over Iraq, but because the Islamic Republic was actually in tune with, and respectful of the majority of Iraqis' popular will. Israeli and Saudi claims that the Islamic Republic will use rapprochement to consolidate its own regional hegemony are not just inaccurate, they are self-servingly disingenuous. For these claims mask what really concerns Israeli and Saudi elites, that their own regional strategies require a hegemonic America in the Middle East. Seeking regional dominance in accommodation with Washington was not only the Shah's foreign policy, it has also been Israel's strategy for decades. Israel's national security strategy, including the open-ended occupation of Arab populations and the consolidation of a nearly absolute freedom of unilateral military initiative in its own neighborhood, requires a hegemonic U.S. in the Middle East that effectively immunizes Israel from the potentially negative consequences regionally and globally of its actions. It also requires a hegemonic America capable of suppressing the emergence of independent power centers in the Middle East, like the Islamic Republic of Iran. For if independent power centers emerge that could constrain what Israeli generals call their country's freedom of military action, in other words, it might, in some circumstances, make Israeli decision makers think twice about initiating conflict. This is what the former Defense Minister Ehud Barak said while he was sitting defense minister about Iran's nuclear program to the New York Times. The concern wasn't that Iran was going to become history's first suicidal nation and take their 1 or 2 bombs and use them against Israel. It was that Israel would have to think twice maybe the next time it went into Lebanon. Similarly, Saudi security requires a hegemonic U.S. For if the United States is not able or willing to invest blood and treasure to micromanage the political outcomes of key regional arenas, like in Egypt, Iraq, in Syria, then Saudi Arabia might have to deal with the popularly determined outcomes in these arenas that it does not like. And such outcomes might ultimately mean that the Saudi royal family has to come to terms with its own public in ways that it has managed to avoid so far. My third point is that U.S. rapprochement with the Islamic Republic of Iran would still be hugely beneficial for the Middle East, including for Israel and Saudi Arabia. In part, this is true because it would mean that, like for America, Israel and Saudi Arabia, too, would have to forsake aspects of their foreign policies that are out of line with regional realities. And here, too, Sino-American rapprochement in the early 70s offers some critical lessons. When Nixon opened to China, to the People's Republic of China, Taiwan and Japan, both long-standing U.S. allies, were dead set against that rapprochement. Chinese-American realignment upended fundamental premises of both Taiwan and Japan's foreign policy strategies. Yet in relatively short order, both Taiwan and Japan adjusted to the new reality of Sino-American normalization. And they didn't just adjust, but with the specter of constant war dramatically decreased, both Taiwan and Japan experienced the greatest surge of economic growth and domestic prosperity in their histories, precisely because Sino-American rapprochement grounded much greater regional stability and created the conditions enabling China's economic integration with the rest of Asia. If America had a real opening to the Islamic Republic, Israel and Saudi Arabia would adjust to that reality, and they would both benefit enormously. My final point is that an American failure to achieve this kind of strategic realignment with the Islamic Republic will have hugely negative ramifications for U.S. standing, not just in the Middle East, but globally. At this point in the evolution of the Middle East balance of power, the United States cannot achieve any of its critical regional objectives: post-conflict stabilization in Afghanistan, resolving the conflict in Syria, fighting the spread of violent jihadi extremism, assuring the adequacy and security of Persian Gulf oil. We can't do any of that without better relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in this context, for President Obama to continue to have all options, including the military option, on the table, which means to threaten yet another Muslim country to disarm it of nuclear weapons it does not have, would elevate the already high level of anti-American sentiment we see across the Middle East, threaten America's remaining Middle Eastern allies, and render their continued cooperation with us practically impossible. President Obama's self-inflicted debacle over his declared intention to attack Syria after chemical weapons were used there in August underscores that at this point, after our strategically failed military interventions in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, the United States can no longer credibly threaten the effective use of force in the Middle East. This is derided in Washington as weakness, as Obama's weakness. But in my view, it gives the United States the best opportunity we have had in generations to pull back from a profoundly damaging pursuit of hegemony in the Middle East and instead to pursue real diplomacy with all of the key states in the region. Thank you.
Well, we will have 45 minutes for Q&A, and I will invite you to participate as widely as possible, but please limit your intervention to 1 minute to a question and not to a lecture, because we will not simply have time. So I will take each time 3 questions and ask the panelists to respond, and then we move on. So please, yes, you first.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can you get the microphone? Yes, please. We have microphones there.
It's extremely enlightening and sophisticated analysis
of the issue. I want to address a point that that Hillary just made about Israel's concern not with the unrealistic expectation that Iran would actually drop a bomb on Israel, but that it would impede their freedom of action, which they now enjoy in the Middle East. But another argument against the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran has to do with the prospect of an arms race, a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. You hear it often said, even by people who might accept the premise that this doesn't threaten Israel in a direct way, that it would set off an arms race and would lead to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to Turkey, to many of its neighbors trying to acquire nuclear weapons. I wonder what any of the panelists would think of that argument.
Let's take 2 more. Yes, please. Yes.
I can talk loud. At least one member of the panel said that Iran has no intention to build nuclear weapons. If that is true, what is this fuss about? Is Iran trying to build medical isotopes? Are they trying to build nuclear energy for electrical purposes? What is the end game of Iran's nuclear program?
Yes, please.
I was wondering, in the context of the American domestic, American domestic policy, how much of it, Mr. Luers, do you think is it internalization of the arguments by senators and congressmen? Do they actually believe what the Israel lobby tells them? Or is it more a matter of campaign finance and things like that? And to what extent?
More a matter of what?
Campaign finance and things like that. And to what extent can we counter that? And similarly with Ms. Everett, are there comparable lessons when Nixon was opening to China? How did he deal with domestic interest groups that were opposed?
Well, thank you. We have 2 questions here. One is on the nuclear issue, and I would ask one of you to respond. And the other one is on the interaction with Congress and the administration and so on. So maybe who would like to respond to the nuclear issue?
I could do the nuclear issue. Yeah, I mean, Hillary and I both, are very firmly persuaded that the Islamic Republic is not seeking to build nuclear weapons. As Hillary said, we went to work for the U.S. government in 1990. We have been hearing every year since then, when we had security clearances, after we left government, didn't have security clearances, we've been hearing, every year that Iran is 3 to 5 years away from a nuclear weapon. Been hearing that since 1990. Americans have been saying that, Israelis have been saying that. Sometimes the Israelis are a little more alarmist. Iran's closer to nuclear weapons. The Iranians don't have nuclear weapons. Both the American and Israeli intelligence communities today say that Iran has not taken a decision to build a nuclear weapon. You know, at 25 years almost, we've been saying they're 3 to 5 years away from a nuclear weapon, and we just keep resetting this 3 to 5 year frame year after year after year after year. Now, you either have to think that Iranians, just like perhaps their DNA is programmed for deception, maybe it's just not all that well programmed for nuclear physics, or you actually have to think that the nuclear program is about something else. I think it's fundamentally about other things. The Iranians, I am very convinced that there is not unanimity, but there is a balance of opinion among Iranian political and policy elites that possession of a small nuclear arsenal would actually make Iran less secure, not more secure. There is a minority camp that disagrees with that, but it is a minority camp. And the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been absolutely clear in his view on that question. More to the point, the Islamic Republic at the highest levels of religious and political authority, meaning both Imam Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei, have said repeatedly, explicitly, that nuclear weapons are haram. They violate Islamic law. They are immoral. The Islamic Republic will not do this. Now, you may say that is just talk, but talk matters in a system that legitimates itself in no small part on its adherence to God's law. For Ayatollah Khamenei or some subsequent supreme leader to say all that stuff we said about nuclear weapons being sinful, never mind. You know, that is going to take a lot of explaining. And there's an important historical case where the Iranians didn't just talk the talk on this, they walked the walk. The 1980s, Iraq's war of aggression against Iran, supported by the United States. Through that war for years, Iran was subjected, military and civilian targets, to regular use of chemical weapons. The United States knew about it. The United States government had helped Iraqis obtain much of the technology they used to produce those chemical weapons, and the United States systematically blocked action by the Security Council against Iraq for using chemical weapons. In the midst of that war, while Iran is being subjected to chemical weapons attack, the military leaders come to Imam Khomeini and they say, look, we inherited from the Shah the capacity to mass produce chemical weapons agent and to weaponize it. We need to do this so we can threaten retaliation in kind. And Khomeini, in the middle of this war, said, no, that is haram. That would be sinful. The Islamic Republic of Iran will not do this. And they didn't do it. When they say they don't want nuclear weapons, after 25 years of having U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies tell us they're 3 years away from it, if they don't have nuclear weapons today, it's because they don't want them. The program is about other things. It is about generating medical isotopes. There is a worldwide shortage of medical isotopes, and they are producing medical isotopes today at the Tehran Research Reactor. The IAEA verifies that. They are producing electricity from nuclear power, and they want to produce more. And because of their experience of being cut off from civilian reactor fuel by Western powers, they want to hedge against that. They want to be able to produce their own enriched uranium and be able to produce their own fuel rods so that no one can ever do to them again what Europeans did to them in the 1980s by cutting off their access to civilian nuclear fuel. They also know, they understand that the skill sets are fungible. Okay? If you know how to enrich uranium, extend your learning curve, you can figure out how to enrich it to weapons grade. I don't think they mind people appreciating that they actually have mastered some of the competencies you might need to build nuclear weapons. There may be some deterrent value in that, but they're not going to build them.
Thank you, Flynt.
Very briefly, the problem is when we and the Iranians talk about nuclear weapons, we're really talking past each other. We're talking about obligations, Article 3.1, centrifuges, subterfuges. They're talking about other things. They're talking about their place in the world and national pride. I saw this very, very vividly a few years ago when President Ahmadinejad came here. As he used to come every year for the General Assembly. He gave a dinner, had these dinner debates with academics and former government officials. They were always worth going to. There was always something interesting said there. And someone asked him, Mr. President, is Iran building a nuclear weapon? He said, no. For ideological reasons, for political reasons, for financial reasons, we are not building a political weapon. You know, do I believe him? I don't know. I can't read his soul, so I don't know. But then he said, but, this is where it gets interesting. He said, but the decision to build a nuclear weapon or not build a nuclear weapon is our decision. You, the international community, you, the UN, you, the United States, you, the IAEA, you, the P5+1, you cannot tell us what to do. And here we go back to this idea of what are we really talking about? We're not talking really about nuclear weapons in this case. We're talking about Iran's place in the world.
Thank you.
Let me ask, the question was asked, why do people believe this? Is it because of the senators tell them? And I think I would take a slightly different tack than the others have been taking. One of the basic reasons we're concerned about what this program was is because it was growing and growing, and we didn't know why. And why do they have all this huge stockpile of 5% uranium, enriched uranium? And what we want is a plan. And I think there's a lot of national pride in just showing they could build this huge stack of enriched uranium. But the American people, first they want an enemy, and Iran has been the perfect enemy. It has all the characteristics of what we want to sort of define our policy. And they've helped us define a policy in the Middle East as I think Hillary said. But a lot of it is disinformation. A lot of it is deliberate influence by conservatives in this country who have had tremendous power in the media. A lot of it is a desire to believe that this is what they really want. And a lot of it is the Iranian own confusion, confusing us about what are they doing with all this nuclear program unless they're going to use it somewhere. They keep saying they're going to have 20 power reactors within the next 10 years, but they're not doing it. So I think there's a lot of ambiguity, but it's driven a great deal by lack of American understanding of what Iran is, what the reason for this crazy program is, as well as this sort of the terrorizing effect of Israel, of other countries, saying it's all about nuclear weapons, because it isn't all about nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Briefly, very briefly, yes.
I think there were just two specific points to the question that weren't addressed. One was whether other states would also weaponize any kind of nuclear power. One precedent that we have is they've also looked at, for example, Saudi Arabia. They've designated Israel as also a mortal enemy, but when Israel acquired 200 plus nuclear weapons, they didn't do that. So we've seen how other states have reacted when a state that they don't like, that they see as an enemy, has gotten nuclear weapons. And I agree with the panelists. I don't think this is about nuclear weapons, but we also have a precedent. Those states didn't act. It's not easy to do. There's no basis for it. The other piece, I think, has to do with the role of domestic lobbying groups and kind of this question about whether they believe it. It's really, really important. It gets to my point about hegemony. Because when Israel was first established for its first 20 years, when the memory of the Holocaust was its freshest, was its most horrific, when Israel arguably, and I don't really take a position on this, but arguably was at its most democratic, when it wasn't occupying the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, Golan Heights, that's when there was almost no American aid to Israel. And AIPAC and the lobbying groups were nothing. They were actually investigated by the FBI when they first tried to open shop in Washington. That changes fundamentally, starting in the 1980s and fundamentally with the end of the Cold War. And so my argument about hegemony is important because what the lobbying groups have been able to do, and not just the Jewish aspects, the Jewish communities from them, but also the Christian evangelical, is they've been able to push on this door of hegemony that Israel is a strategic asset. Not that it's Jewish, but that it's pro-American. And it can be the tip of the American spear in the Middle East. And that's why a U.S. ability to come to terms with the Islamic Republic and to stop pursuing hegemony would not just benefit us, but I think would also benefit the Israelis and even benefit us here politically because we wouldn't have this mutually corrupting edifice of this domestic lobbying group having such influence over policy.
Thank you. Okay, more questions? Yes,
You
please.
seem to have more answers than you have questions.
It will be a little bit more brief.
I know, we've got to be brief.
Yes, right.
Thank you very much. I have two questions actually, and one is addressed to Ambassador Lambert. The first question, Mr. Lambert, during the hostage crisis in 1980, if I'm not mistaken, you had met with the then President of the Islamic Republic and now the current Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. So my question is, what impressions did that meeting leave on you about the Supreme Leader? And also a question to the rest of the panelists. What incentives do you think can the United States provide to the Islamic Republic in order for the Islamic Republic to stop its support for the brutal Assad regime in the Syrian crisis? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take, yes, ma'am, there. Yeah, in the back there, yes.
My question is for Flynt Leverett, and it's about your book, Going to Tehran, or both of your book. You published it during Ahmadinejad's presidency, and you often refer to him as highly intelligent, a charming leader, having a broad support base, and someone who should be engaged at that time by the U.S. And what I wanted to ask is how you kind of justify calling to engage with him, even as he repeatedly advocated to wipe Israel off the map, who during a farewell ceremony this July said that publicizing his Holocaust denial was one of his major achievements in his presidency, and who also stated that it's not atomic bombs that threaten the world, but Western morals and culture.
Okay, a third question? Yes, please.
Well, Iran, we're talking about trust, and nuclear is only half of the Iran picture. The other half is its imperialism. For example, its penetration of Latin America and its trading of operatives in Latin America to attack the United States, such as the Saudi ambassador. So how do we develop a trust relationship with somebody that's a very aggressive country? Thank you.
Well, I think we will first try to have answers for these three questions, and then we'll move on.
Okay.
You are first.
Quick.
Very personal.
Very quick.
Yes.
Very personal question. I did meet then Hujjatul Islam Khamenei, who was the Friday prayer leader of Tehran in April of 1980. It was reported, of course, it was televised, shown on Iranian television, reported very accurately in a newspaper called the Washington Evening Star, which some of you may even remember. In any case, it was a five-minute meeting in which I told him, he asked if I had any complaints, and I said only that the Iranians have overdone their hospitality. And that sometimes they have this wonderful trait called ta'aruf, which means to sort of take care of, part of it is taking care of guests. I said sometimes too much ta'aruf can be a problem. He knew exactly what I was talking about. When I was saying that this was a shameful event that had violated every tradition, every national and religious tradition of his country. He knew exactly. He's not stupid. He knew what I was saying. I don't really have a great, much of an impression. It was a long time ago, 34 years ago. He didn't have some of the sort of bitterness, the personal bitterness that I felt in others, or he suppressed it. But what he did do was, at the end of this thing, he went out, after he had met with with me and some of my colleagues. He went out and spoke to television, and he said, I spoke to the hostages, and they're all so happy. They're just in such good condition, and they're so happy with their conditions, and they thank the students for being so nice to them. I mean, it was outrageous. If I ever see him again, and I don't know I will, I'm going to ask him about this. And I said, sir, have you no shame at all?
Okay, the second question then.
Yeah, on Ahmadinejad. Yeah, I do think Ahmadinejad is both very intelligent, and I think his presidency was a consequential one. And I think there were openings to engage the Islamic Republic during his presidency, which the United States, both under George W. Bush and under Obama, very egregiously mishandled. If you read Going to Tehran, you would note that Ahmadinejad never once said that Israel should be wiped off the map, or that Iran would wipe Israel off the map. What he said in Farsi was, "In regime ishgalgare Quds bayad asafeya ruzgar mav shavad." In regime ishgalgare Quds, that's this regime occupying Jerusalem, his term for Israel. Bayad, must, asafeya ruzgar, from the page of time or the page of history, mav shavad, disappear or vanish. He's not saying, I'm going to make it disappear. He's saying it must disappear. And if you go on about 2 paragraphs down in the speech, when he talks about Israel disappearing, it's going to disappear in his view like the Soviet Union disappeared, or like apartheid South Africa disappeared, because of its own internal contradictions, not because of external aggression by Iran or anyone else. I defy you to show me any statement, authenticated statement, verbatim quote, where Ahmadinejad or any other high-ranking Iranian official is saying that Iran is going to wipe Israel from the map. It does not exist. Iranians think Israel is fundamentally illegitimate. They think it's an apartheid state. They think it's a racist state. And they think that a state like that cannot survive indefinitely in the 21st century. But they think it's going to disappear because of its own problems. As far as...
Briefly, please.
Okay. I think if you look at Ahmadinejad's statements about the Holocaust, he's not trying to appeal to Western audiences. He is appealing, and public opinion polls show it had enormous positive reception throughout the Arab world, throughout other Middle Eastern Muslim societies, what he is trying to say is, why should an event, a crime perpetrated by Europeans, why should Muslim Middle Easterners pay the price for that crime? He's not just criticizing Israeli or U.S. policy on the margins, a little too violent, little too excessive in this way or that way. He is engaging in a fundamental critique of the existence of the current Israeli political order. And it was an enormously effective public diplomacy strategy for Iran that meant that throughout his presidency, Ahmadinejad was, according to polls, one of the 2 or 3 most admired leaders in the Sunni Arab world. Okay? And that meant it was going to be a lot harder for any Sunni Arab government in Saudi Arabia or any place else to cooperate with the United States in attacking Iran. There was a very, very clear strategic rationality to what he was doing. And on the Syria point, you know, the Iranians would tell you, don't tell us about our support for the brutal Assad regime. Assad retains, by all indications, the support of more than 50% of Syrian society, and we don't want to be lectured to by people who are supporting an opposition to Assad that is increasingly dominated by al-Qaeda.
Mohiaddin, would you have something and particularly address it?
Yeah, I think, you know, my take on Ahmadinejad is actually different. I think in a larger sense, in terms of what I discussed in terms of the successful securitization of Iran, where it matters, which is here, I think he was a gift to the United States and Israel. Therefore, if it wasn't there, it would have been invented. I think the damage in giving content to a securitization language which doesn't need substance, it needs symbols. It needs hijack language that it doesn't need discussion. It was damaging to Iran. I think it was. You know, it's correct to say that, you know, of course he didn't say exactly that, but it doesn't matter. This relationship is about symbolic languages and hijacking languages and using strategic core languages to frame. In that sense, he missed the point. And repeatedly he was told not to continue that. But I think he was a domestic president, not an international president. He was a man of his own. He didn't actually care about, you know, what happens internationally. And so I don't want to go into details of what his presidency actually meant for that. I have a larger point also to make in terms of, you know, because we're losing time here. I think in the larger questions of a dilemma between the two countries, it's a unique condition and it's almost an impossible. And here, I may sound defending the United States, but the Iranians are asking for the United States to think in a way that makes its power inconsequential. It's difficult. For a hegemonic power to approach other countries who are not equally powerful, it is a counterintuitive self-education that is difficult to achieve. So to use China model, it's an interesting, you know, model to think about. We've been talking about this for a long time. The difficulty with the China model is that Americans do not consider Iran as China and have a difficult time to accept Iran as equal. And the Iranians keep asking for equality and so on. So we have a very peculiar condition that two unequal power, one is specifically very unforgiving about defiance, the United States, engage in a very tricky condition of balancing each other. And that is why I emphasize that asymmetrical balance of power is critical to this relationship. If that asymmetrical balance of power collapses, you will see more coercion and you will see conflict. And therefore, the core to Iran deterrence against military option is domestic. It's not external. It's deepening its legitimacy at home. It basically eliminates the regime change strategy, and it makes war option extremely costly and inconsequential, and therefore a breathing space for diplomacy, and therefore the need to think about trust. It's a very delicate asymmetrical balance. They make a mistake. I think they made a mistake before. They lost ground between 2009 and 2013. I wrote that repeatedly in Iranian press. I talk about it in Iran repeatedly. The strategic decision was Iran to make, and they did it in 2013. And therefore, we have a new condition. It is under this new condition of asymmetrical balance that the military option is questionable. And therefore, I think this point has to be hammered in here in this country, that they cannot win this war against Iran, whether through coercive measures, through sanctions, or military options. And if force is used against Iran, there will be a lot of destructions, but we have to remember there's a delicate relationship between force and power. When power collapses, force is used. Force is usually used to resuscitate power. And it doesn't do that anymore in this case, as was discussed. If we can socialize actors into this fundamental issue, then there will be a room for negotiations. And then we need something, I think, bigger than that, which is, I call in that paper the element of reflexivity. Reflexivity means that actors lose the sight of the fact that after repeating and routinizing their conflicts, they are trapped in it. They're actually not making decision anymore. They are basically following the script written for them by the structure of rules around them. Reflexivity means distance from the conflict itself and room to think again. It is this part, I think, which is very important to see if Obama can make a move on this reflexivity question. I think Rouhani did the move. It's time to see if the Americans can actually distance themselves from this scrutinized element of the conflict and think anew about it in some way.
Thank you. I think we have one last response to a question. And John.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm glad you asked that question. You know, I've dealt with Iran just on a personal note. On full disclosure, my connections to Iran go back over 50 years, and they're very personal as well. They're professional, but they're also personal. I'm no big fan, honestly, of the Islamic Republic. It's not a form of government that I like very much. It's not one that I would particularly choose to live on. But that's personal. That's a different issue. The issue you have raised shows what happens when two countries don't talk to each other at all. The other side becomes superhuman, capable of anything. And the instances you made about Latin America and this bizarre plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador, what are they? These are not signs of strength. These are signs of weakness. Iran, by its nature, by its geography, by its ethnography, is isolated. It is not Sunni like its neighbors. It is not Arab like its neighbors. It is not Turkish like its neighbors. They are the Bretons of the Middle East. They speak a language that no one understands. They venerate saints that no one has ever heard of. I mean, if you're a good Sunni, who is Hazrat Abbas, for God's sake? Where does he come from? Where does that come from? Who are their friends in the region? Syria, which is on the rocks, and Armenia, of all places. This little landlocked Christian countries where they both hate the Azaris so much. In that case, who are Shia, by the way. There's where they are. Now, the problem is that the danger is not from Iranian strength, but Iranian weakness. I'll once again quote the brilliant Saadi. 700 years ago, he said, "Have you not seen the cat? When it is cornered, with its tiny claws, it will tear out the eyes of a leopard." And that is what, I think we need to worry. What is more concerning is not a strong Iran, but is a weak and diplomatically isolated and humiliated Iran.
Well, thank you. I think we reach the end of this debate. And,
I'd like to make a quick point on this because I think that's the key argument that I'm against. And that's a dangerous argument because the weakness argument actually feeds into the questions of finishing them off. I disagree with that fundamentally. I think Iran is not in a weak position. That's my key argument, that there is a delicate asymmetrical balance in the relationship between the United States and Iran. And that asymmetrical balance is key in contextualizing possibility of negotiations. For the moment, and that's the illusion in Washington now, that we have them on the run, let's finish them off. I think that message is wrong. Iran is lonely strategically because it relies on its own defense, but it's not isolated. Those are two different concepts. Self-sufficiency in defense does not mean isolation. It's the only country which can conduct a fourth-generation warfare at home and abroad. That's key strategic balancer against the United States. We have to hammer this point, and therefore, rationally, the coercive option does not deliver the policy anymore.
well, thank you. I would like to thank on your behalf the distinguished speakers who contributed tonight to this debate, which is a very difficult debate. I do not mean our debate, but in general when it concerns Iran. It has been going on for now 35 years. I think it is time, as all of our distinguished friends said, that we open a line of communication. And that is not simply on the government-to-government side, but also from people to people. The day we see more Iranians invited to the United States, more Iranian scholars coming to the US, more US scholars going to Iran. In fact, when we see someday joint projects between Iranians and Americans, then I think we will understand a little bit more about what drives the anxiety, what drives the fears on both sides, and eventually construct a better future. The model, the image of Nixon going to China, yes, Obama going to Tehran, that will be psychologically within this culture of communication, something that will make a huge difference. The same with the new president, Rouhani, going to the White House or meeting. They did not do it at the General Assembly. Apparently they mobilized all the diplomacy that was necessary to avoid each other. When they were walking, I was there. In fact, they were walking practically next to each other, but that is not certainly the way to do these things. So maybe one day all of these will appear to us historically as a little bit outdated, archaic, and we move on the same way that we have seen many other archaic things. Remember the Algerian War between the French and the Algerians. These same arguments were used at the time. Remember Vietnam, when you see the picture of Senator McCain going to Vietnam and going to visit those who have inflicted all the pain on him and recognizing their dignity. So when you see what is happening, what happened in South Africa, all of these might appear one day as historically dated, outdated, and so it is our role as educators, as universities, to take the lead on this and to open the line of discussion. And this is what we try to do. So thank you all tonight for coming to this.
Thank you, Mustapha.
Thank you.